Jiro here for Umbra Games with a review of Octopath Traveler, published by Square Enix and developed by Acquire, exclusively for Nintendo Switch. At first glance, it's easy to see that Octopath is calling back to the older days of the JRPG, with their pixelized graphics and turn-based side-view combat. While a lot of folks are drawing references to the Final Fantasy series, what I'm more closely reminded of is Square's Saga series during the PS1 and early PS2 era. In Octopath, you have 8 different playable characters. You get to choose which character to start with and play through Chapter 1 of their story before venturing out to the rest of the world, where you can see from the overworld map which city each character and their respective Chapter 1 begins. As you encounter each character, you can add them to your party, up to 4, and complete the content together. Once Chapter 1 of that character has been completed, that character's Chapter 2 becomes available elsewhere in the world, all the way through Chapter 4s. Each chapter has a suggested level requirement you can see from the world map, and sometimes this may take a bit of grinding to bring your party's levels up to that challenge, especially adding in the fact that characters don't gain experience points if they're not present in the party during battle. While the world does have a lot of freedom, the game is not open in its entirety, sometimes locked behind content progression barriers, often with a sign telling your party not to go that way. As such, the basic progression through a chapter is enter a city, get some cutscenes to explain what's happening, and then go into a dungeon that is often tied through a screen or two from your destination. After a dungeon crawl and a boss fight, you'll be back in town for a cutscene that ties it all up. Chapters begin when you enter the specified town with the chosen character in your party, but you can also choose not to start it when you enter. Chapters can also be put on pause, and you can do others and then come back by visiting the tavern and talking to the bartender. This process is even further streamlined by allowing you to fast travel to any city you've previously visited so you can skip around as needed. Now, while it is a bit formulaic, I will say the characters do have unique personalities, and their stories are what I've taken to calling street level, with no threatening apocalypse, empire, or supervillain, but a tale that unravels to each motivations and instincts, which is kind of a refreshing change in this genre. Characters are further distinguished by the presence of a base class, a unique skill in battle, and a unique ability when interacting with NPCs. I started with Honnet, and your character has to stay in the party until you finish his or her final chapter. Honnet is a hunter and has the 8 unlockable hunter skills, but uniquely can capture and summon beasts to use in battle. This is done Pokemon style, where the lower the HP, the greater the chance of capture. Each beast has a set number of times it can be used in battle, and then they're set free. While talking with NPCs, Honnet has the Provoke ability. When used, she's thrown solo into battle versus the target and can only use summoned beasts and items to take down her opponent. Upon victory, that NPC is knocked out, which allows entry through previously blocked doors and locations. Therian the Thief has a steal percentage of lifting items off NPCs, where Trust of the Merchant can purchase those same goods instead. There's a bit of an overlap here in that Ulbrich can challenge someone to a duel with the same results as Honnet, and Alphen the Apothecary inquires, where Cyrus the Scholar scrutinizes to the same outcomes. In the majority of the character's chapters, these skills will be required at some point to progress. Now, to go a little deeper into the battle system, there are a couple of mechanics that separate Octopath from the usual turn-based combat. First is the presence of BP. Each party member starts with 2 BP in every battle. They're the small dots at the top of their status card on the right. Each turn, if unused, will give the character an additional BP. These boost points can be used to add an extra melee attack for each point consumed, or to boost the power of an ability, like spells and weapon skills. Use this in combination with the second mechanic, which is breaking. Every enemy has a minimum of 1 box under their avatar that begins as a question mark the first time you encounter them. These are the enemy weaknesses. You can see the shield icon to the left of that. These are their armor points. Every time you hit an enemy with something they're weak to, it subtracts from that number until it reaches 0 and they break. This stops them from taking an action for this turn and the next, and also majorly lowers their defense. You can reveal weaknesses by hitting the enemy with an appropriate weapon or element. The Scholar class also has an ability called Analyze that can help out in this process. So, as you can probably guess, the main strategy in combat is to work enemies down to the breaking point as best as possible, and then throw in the boost points to do massive damage when their defenses are lowered. Bosses often mix things up by changing weaknesses through a fight, increasing defenses where certain weaknesses won't work for a set number of turns, or have minions that have to be taken out before you can hit them with their weakness. The BP system felt a bit reminiscent of the Bravely Default series, but less gimmicky, because instead of bypassing your turn entirely like you did in those games, you just build up power. So you're still working on taking down weaknesses and strategizing instead of just passing turns to take them later. Each character class can only equip specific weapon types. For Hunter, it's a bow and axe, for Warrior, it's a sword and spear, etc. When preparing an attack on a turn, you can flip left or right to swap through the character's equipped weapons. Abilities that are weapon-based will show the icon for the weapon type next to its name. You can unlock new class abilities by spending job points. These are earned through combat. It takes an increasing amount of points for each successive unlock, but excluding the 8th divine skill that requires all others to be unlocked first, you can open these skills in any order. Now, while at first having only specific weapons per character can seem a bit limiting to be prepared for all enemy weaknesses your party may encounter, You can eventually unlock all of the characters' classes to be equipped as subclasses on other characters. Adding a thief subclass to the hunter allows for daggers and swords in addition to bows and axes. While the subclass is equipped, you can spend points on that class's skills to pick from them as well. You also receive a stat bonus with it equipped. The big kicker for equipping multiple subclasses is to unlock support abilities. As you unlock more and more skills in a job, there are 4 unique support abilities each class can offer, and you can equip these even after you remove that subclass. So for example, learning the Merchant's SP Saver support ability, which expends half the SP, skill points, for all abilities, can be useful for the classes whose main purpose is casting, like the Scholar. The Warrior has a Break 9,999 damage support ability, which can also be helpful as you reach those later levels. There is quite a pile of various weapons and gear you can acquire, but more importantly in the way you acquire them. Nearly every town has a weapon shop, but what they offer is fairly selective. One town will focus more on staves, while another will have bows, usually a variety with increasing strength and price tag. Using the Acquire Scrutinize skill on specific NPCs in that town will sometimes unlock additional gear for sale in those shops too. Some weapons I only seem to find as stealable or purchasable from NPCs, while other more unique sounding stuff was found in chests. Now, it's possible some of this gear did show up in a town that I didn't check for the rare stuff, but having various ways of acquisition, like finally getting away with stealing a super powerful piece from an NPC that only had a 3% steal rate, made you constantly on the lookout for upgrades. Which reminds me, if you do fail in your stealing or inquiries 5 times in a town, it will tarnish your reputation, and you'll have to go pay the tavern keeper to spread good rumors about you, otherwise you can't perform any NPC action on any townspeople at all. Chances of stealing and acquiring seem to increase with the performing character's level. There's a mini-map of sorts in the lower right corner, although it's actually probably better thought of as a radar. You can get the general idea of the direction where towns and dungeons and the occasional hidden items are, and when it's the focal point of the main quest step you're on, those icons will turn green. Optional quest givers will show up as orange stars on the radar, received pretty much exclusively in towns I think, and that's further reinforced by speech bubbles above talkable NPC heads, reflecting green for main and orange for side. Side quests are a little interesting in that it's not always readily apparent what you're supposed to do. Sometimes the NPC simply wants an item you can steal or purchase through thief and merchant abilities, sometimes scrutinizing or inquiring of someone in a completely different city that had something to say on the topic, and then talking to the quest giver can complete it. Sometimes it's challenging or provoking someone too. The game does have a screen that tracks your open quest, but doesn't really provide much in the way of hints that I could find, so talking and actually reading NPC dialogue if you have the intention of completing these quests is very important. There's a chunk of optional content, including 4 optional bosses that give 4 hidden subclasses. There's a final optional questline you can do post-game that opens up a final dungeon to what some are calling the true final boss. Now, I don't think it's spoilery to comment on narrative structure, but this is the first time I ever remember seeing a game set up like this. As I mentioned, the individual 8 stories are smaller in scale, usually involve a villain or resolving some feelings or whatnot, but if you pay attention, you start to see some repeated names and common threads here and there that eventually all come together to that bigger villain you didn't know you were fighting. But this all takes place post-game and optional content. And yeah, it takes a lot of grinding, and I'm not really sure the payoff is worth it, but it's still a really neat idea. One other method of narrative delivery comes through travel banter. As you proceed through a chapter, there are optional conversations that can be accessed by hitting the plus button when you see the text in the upper right of the screen. These are chapter and character dependent, so the things you learn can change based on who you're bringing along. As far as level structure and design goes, the game really reminded me of an MMORPG type setup. Each starting city had low-level areas around it, and as you ventured an additional screen outwards into the wilderness, the danger level increased. It could have been coincidence, but it seemed like the enemy count per battle increased as I got more characters in my party up to my max of 4 when I first started the game, and I believe some of the subsequent starting areas went up in level as my party size increased as well, but I didn't track that or test it. The dungeon areas themselves could have used a little more variety. The dungeons were made up of probably 40% forests, under 40% were caves and ruins, and 20% were mansions. There were some palette swapping and lighting differences, but they were all fairly simple, with a lot of side paths that would lead pretty simply to some treasure, and a few that had paths obscured by the scenery or foreground, making it difficult to see the path to get to that hidden chest. I did have a slight annoyance in that there was at least one purple chest in every dungeon, and the only party member that could open these was Therian, your thief, making it feel like you always had to bring him along, which means maybe he's a great pick to be your starting character. Graphically, well, you like the style or you don't. They took the pixel look of the late Super Nintendo, early PS1 era and added modern lighting and effects, and to me it worked out really well. Walking through the snow and sand areas and seeing the dunes and piles sparkle in the back looked really neat. When you're in a dungeon area, your front party member will carry a lantern, which casts shadows all around the 2D sprites of your party. Enemy designs were reused and palette swap, but there was such a variety even in the number of base models, and all the bosses were these huge, intimidating sprites, and yeah, just aesthetically it really worked for me. The music is also very well orchestrated, with plenty of great catchy tunes, again driving back to an earlier age when not just everything was atmospheric symphony noise. Overall, Octopath Traveler was a solid trip down memory lane for the turn-based RPG genre. Its combat has unique mechanics that don't feel gimmicky, gives you a good amount of character customization options. Each playable character had a good amount of personality. Its narrative structure presents several entertaining stories as such on a more personal level, leaving the apocalypse and sense of urgency to some post-game content. The game's chapters did get locked into a little pattern of repetition, and the locations could have used a bit more variety. The art style had neat presentation, the music was solid, and there's quite a bit of content and some challenging optional stuff to do. Rated as a turn-based role-playing game, Octopath Traveler hits an 84 out of 100 on my true 0 to 100 scale, where 50 is an average game. This is Jiro for Umbra Games. Thanks for watching.